Hello everybody, in this video, Nicolau, Marco Lam and Michael Fong will explain thoroughly about supply-side policies. Hope you enjoy. So, what are supply-side policies? Well, it is simple. They are used to shift the lower aggregate supply curve to the right for long-term economic growth. There are two major types of supply-side policies, which are market-oriented, favored by neoclassical economists, and interventionist, favored by the Keynesians. In the early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and other neoclassical economists agreed that the real GDP growth depends on aggregate supply rather than demand. Since then, many governments around the world have pursued policies influenced by supply-side thinking. The reason why governments adopt these policies is because it can achieve rapid economic growth, price stability, and full employment all at the same time. These happen because in the neoclassical point of view, the economy can correct inflationary and recessionary problems itself. Now I will introduce the first policy, which is reducing the size of the government sector and increasing competition. Government does not care much about profits, hence it doesn't need to seek for highest efficiency. But private firms do care about profits, hence they will use the most efficient way to compete with each other and gain most profits. As profits increase, the private firms will produce more, and the right shift of SRAS curve can also eliminate deflation, which cannot be corrected by demand-side policies. Examples of such include privatization, which means a transfer from public to private ownership, letting a private firm build, finance, and operate public services, contracting out public services to the private firms, including human resources management, information technology, accounting services, and many others. The fourth one will be deregulation of private sector activities, because government regulations will limit competition and increase inefficiency. And the last one will be to restrict monopoly power by enforcing anti-monopoly legislation, breaking up large firms, and preventing mergers between big firms. As a result, these will all result in increased competition, efficiency, lower price level, improved quality, and last but not the least, economic growth. But as a smart economist, don't even try to ignore any disadvantages. For privatization, a public monopoly might simply become a private one. Hence, increased regulation and bureaucracy control are needed to limit unwanted monopolistic effects. For reference, Hong Kong Post Office is a privatized firm. Moreover, lower income groups will become poorer, especially if the private services involve necessities. Further, there may be unemployment because firms want to cut costs by laying off workers. It is basically the same for private financing of public projects in the case of prices. Since private firms have to cover costs and earn profits, they might provide a higher price than the government. Further, the private firms may not care about population safety needs because they want to keep the lowest cost possible. Also, the government may not easily adapt the policies into meeting changing conditions demanded by the society. A similar loss of control can be experienced in contracting out. Besides, contracting out might waste internal talent as well as losing government jobs. How about deregulation? Many say it is good for lowering production costs and increasing efficiency, but others say that this sometimes leads to undesirable outcomes like higher prices and lower quality services. In fact, after the 2009 financial crisis, people wanted regulation of financial services and nationalization, which is obviously against the market-oriented policies. And if you ask for social deregulation, I would say no, because the public generally don't like it. But remember, these measures are quite controversial, so they must be very carefully done. And I will introduce the second major MO policy, which is improving incentives by lowering taxes, which are mainly the personal income tax, interest income tax, and the business tax. Personal income tax change is part of a fiscal policy which changes aggregate demand. However, some argue that it changes aggregate supply too, because this increases after-tax income, and people will work more as they expect on a higher income. This means the GDP will rise too. Secondly, most people need to pay taxes of interest income from savings. Interest income tax cuts will encourage them to save more for the investment. And the circular flows tells that the greater the saving, the more funds available for investment, and therefore the greater the capital production and the GDP. On the other hand, lower business taxes can increase investment spending, and hence increasing resources for producing new and better capital goods and pursuing technological innovations. Labor will get employed more often as well, and all these contribute to greater GDP. However, many don't think these policies are effective enough for GDP growth because of several reasons. Some ask if the tax policies may have larger impacts on aggregate demand rather than supply, thereby not bringing intended supply-side effects. Personal income tax cuts increase disposable income, which may encourage people to work less if they spend extra income for leisure. If true, this means that it will increase aggregate demand more than aggregate supply. Moreover, if tax cuts affect more on aggregate demand, then tax cuts can cause inflation. Another problem is that tax cuts may worsen income distribution because as the rich earn most of the interest income and business profits, and therefore increases their after-tax incomes more than that of other people. Furthermore, many argue that tax cuts might increase the government deficit unless the government spending decreases. But then, this might be a wrong contractionary fiscal policy for shrinking economy.
Hey Michael, let's get rest for a bit and let me explain the labor market policies. Well, labor market measures are sometimes referred as increasing labor market flexibility and include abolishing minimum wage legislation. This will allow the wage to drop to equilibrium and reduce unemployment. As wage gets lowered, firms earn more and hence produce more capital goods, followed by economic growth. Another way is to weaken the labor unions because unions can always secure and even increase wages. The third method is by reducing unemployment benefits. Some say that unemployment benefits might make people less motivated for seeking jobs. There are laws to protect workers' security in many countries. Some say that reducing job security increases employment and profit, because firms tend to hire new workers if they can fire bad workers easily and without cost. In conclusion, all these will introduce competition, employment, lower labor costs, and wage responsiveness to the forces of supply and demand. However, we don't know if they really work. For example, for minimum wage legislation, some argue workers getting higher than equilibrium wages will work harder. This makes the firm want more workers and hence increase employment. Besides, if protection is reduced, workers might get lower incomes and finally bring up with income inequalities, especially hurting the poor with very low income. Also, unemployment benefits can play an important role in a recession, as firms cut back on output and unemployment increases. This lowers people's income and hence decrease consumer spending. If unemployment benefits are high, they can cover income loss but bring up GDP. Now, moving on to the last part, which is freeing up international trade and capital flows. This increases global competition and therefore improves resource allocation globally. Bear in mind that this can increase competition not only domestically, but also across international boundaries.
Hey Marco, have some rest and let me introduce the last policy, which is the interventionist. Firstly, this is different from the market-oriented one. Interventionist firms argue that the economy can only increase the output by government intervention. The first way is by training and education. This can improve labor employment quality and hence productivity. Therefore, the output will increase too. Better healthcare services can quickly cure the sick and injured and get them back to work instantly. Besides, healthy workers will always be so productive and efficient. Another method is technology innovation by research and development, because technology contributes to a better future and a higher output. Further, R&D gives spillover benefits to third parties, which is a good thing in economics. In fact, some governments use tax reduction to encourage producers to develop technology. Employment agencies can give information to both firms and workers, and thus lessen the time for successful employment and increase efficiency. Tax reduction, lower interest loans, and business guidance can help small and medium enterprises, which are roots to a well-built society, can make their business successful, followed by more profits, higher employment, and so on. Governments always reduce taxes, providing subsidies and tariffs to help industries because they are vital for production. Also, improving infrastructures, especially developing ones, will help because they are important for providing physical capital, including telecommunication, airports, ports, bridges, dams, and railway. Moreover, better infrastructures can help to increase efficiency in other areas. For example, railway and road can save time. Goods and products can also be transported and costs can be lowered. And better telecommunicating system can help economic activities to be carried out more efficiently. As a result, we can see that the interventionist is very different from the market-oriented. Interventionists mainly support industries. They all shift the RRAS curve to the right, or the AS curve to the right in the Keynesian model. For advantages, the government can help in specific areas, which introduce long-term economic growth. It also allows the government to support firms with potential growth and help them to go further in the future. However, some do not agree with the interventionists because it will introduce resource misallocation and inefficiency. The waste resources can be used for helping the poor and other purposes. The market-oriented supply-side policy will not have these problems.